What's going on, Nasteey Nation? It's Nasteey, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over my top 10 worst support champions to play in solo queue. There's a lot of champions that you may think are good champions because you see them thrive in the competitive scene, but the thing is these champions only thrive in the competitive scene and they actually can't carry any of that over to solo queue. I know a lot of people will want to play these champions because they think they're good, but I wanted to make this video to let you guys know that you should not be playing these champions in solo queue because they just simply do not work in that setting. With all that being said, if you guys do go on to enjoy this video or find it helpful, then be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Also, be sure to let me know down in the comment section below if you agree with the champions that I include on this list, or if you disagree, let me know if there's a champion that you think was on this list that shouldn't have been on this list, or if there's a champion that maybe should have been included on this list. That should just about do it for this little introduction, so without further ado, let's get into the video.
Keep it on the level, keep it on the level. I'm climbing up the...
Now, fair warning, before we actually get into the list, just know that none of the champions on this list are going to be in a particular order. They're all just on this list because all of these champions are bad solo queue champions. So for starters, let's start off with Kench at number 1 on my list. Kench is a champion that you've probably seen a lot in the competitive scene, and that's because he's really good when you have voice comms and you're able to be on the same page as your ADC. Being able to eat your ADC in the middle of a fight and then reposition them later on is really important, and it's also just one of the most efficient ways of peeling in the entire game. When you're able to completely remove your ADC from the game at a specific point in time, it's really impactful. However, in solo queue, we don't have these voice comms, so you can't be on the same page as your ADC, and often when players pick Kench and they take him into their solo queue games, or just eating their ADC at a time that their ADC does not want to be eaten. So what essentially happens is the ADC will just spam right click until they are out of the ability, and then the ability is on cooldown and it was practically wasted. I do see Kench as an overall good champion, but the only problem is you really need to have voice comms in order to communicate with your teammates and be on the same page and make sure that you're using that crucial ability at the exact right time, because it has such a long cooldown, and if you waste it, then you won't have it again for the remainder of the team fight. I really like the concept and design around Kench, so I hope they can rework him a little bit or maybe buff some of his numbers so that he's a little bit more viable in solo queue, but at least for now, just leave him in the competitive scene and try to avoid playing him in solo queue. Up next on the list, I have Braum, and Braum is another one of those champions that you probably think is good because you see him all the time in competitive play, but he just doesn't translate well to solo queue. Braum is another champion similar to Kench that is really good at peeling, and that is typically something that you want in a support champion, but the problem is in solo queue, peeling isn't nearly as valuable as engaging and making plays. Making plays is a lot more valuable than denying the enemy team from making plays, and Braum isn't the best when it comes to making plays. Sure, he does have his slow from his Q, and he has a small knockup from his ultimate, but overall, these abilities, even though they are pretty good, they don't really compare to other engaged supports in the game, and I think that engaged supports as a whole just tend to have an upper hand when it comes to champions like Braum, who focus a little bit more on utility. I think pretty much everybody can agree that a Thresh landing his hook or a Leona landing her E are both going to be a lot more valuable than a Braum landing his Q, and it's pretty much for this reason that Braum is not the best in solo queue, because everything he does is really underwhelming except for peeling, and again, peeling just isn't the greatest thing to focus on when it comes to playing in solo queue. The next champion I want to talk about is probably a bit of a controversial one, and that's going to be Yumi. And the reason that I think Yumi is going to be controversial to put on this list is because there is this concept of Yumi being very broken, and I would agree that in the past Yumi has been really strong and she's been really frustrating to deal with, but overall I think that's all Yumi was. She was frustrating and difficult to deal with. At the same time though, Yumi players weren't actually doing all that much. Sure, what they were doing was frustrating to play against, but they weren't actually having that large of an impact on their team, and it's for this reason that Yumi has never really had a high win rate in solo queue. Again, it goes back to this idea that just because she's frustrated doesn't mean that she's good. In competitive play, on the other hand, Yumi can thrive a lot more because she actually has the capability to rely on her teammates. A champion like Yumi that literally attaches to her allies and just hopes that they position correctly and don't get her killed, that's what allows Yumi to be really good, when she can rely on teammates to keep her safe and play around that. However, in solo queue, you can't rely on your teammates, and that's what makes Yumi not the best, is because you are always putting yourself in danger by attaching to an ally, because you're not in voice comms with them, you're playing with a random player, you never really know what they're going to do, and that could hurt you more times than not. At the end of the day, Yumi may look like a good champion overall, but because she has to rely on her teammates, that doesn't make her a great champion to play in solo queue. Next up on the list, I have Rakan, and Rakan used to be a good champion to play in solo queue, but after all the changes that they've done to him over the years, all the small nerfs here and there, they've made it so that Rakan is a lot more of a utility support rather than an engaged support. It goes back to the same concept that in solo queue, peeling is not nearly as valuable as engaging. These days, when you engage as Rakan, it's not nearly as simple because you do have that half-second window in between your ultimate ability and your W ability. And I know that window may not sound that big, but it actually makes such a big difference because it makes it so that your engage is much more telegraphed. not being able to go straight from your ultimate to your W allows the enemy team to react a lot easier, and thus makes it so that it's really hard for you to engage properly. At the same time, they've also nerfed his ultimate ability over the years quite a bit, to the point that it doesn't actually give you all that much movement speed, also making it a lot harder for you to engage. I think that the overall kit for Rakan has potential to make him a good and strong solo queue champion if they put a larger emphasis on his engage tools, but for right now, he's kind of all over the place. All of his abilities are decent rather than his engage abilities being the core of his kit, and until they decide to tweak things to make him more of an engage support rather than a utility support, I think he'll continue to be a champion that is only good in competitive and not good in solo queue. Up next on the list, I have Zilean, and I have Zilean on this list because he's another one of those champions that is very team reliant. I think that laning double bombs can make for some really cool and flashy plays, but it's not nearly as simple as people may think it is, and I think that overall Zilean relies a lot on his teammates to set up plays for him. He relies a lot on his teammates setting up CC for him so he can land these double bombs, and without your teammates, without that coordination, you're probably not going to be landing too many double bombs, and thus you won't be all too impactful as Zilean. Also, if you think about it, his ultimate ability is a team play ability. You're going to be using this on your teammates to keep them alive more times than you're keeping yourself alive, and that's just another one of those abilities that is putting a larger emphasis on allowing your teammates to carry rather than carrying the game yourself, and this is a mentality that works in competitive play and not so much in solo queue. So overall, Zilean being a very team reliant champion doesn't thrive too much in solo queue. Up next on the list, I have Alistar, and I have Alistar on this list because even though he is an engaged support, and I've been talking a lot so far in this video about engaged supports being really good in solo queue because they can make plays and then thus carry the game for their team, even though he has all of these qualities of an engaged support, he's just so overwhelmed by all the other engaged supports in the game. Thresh, Leona, and Blitzcrank, just to name a few, are all much stronger when it comes to engaging and having more carry potential in their games in comparison to Alistar. And I think the main reason for that being is because Alistar is shorter ranged, and he also has a kit that is really good for peeling. So when you're trying to split up your kit in between engaging and peeling, rather than just focusing on engaging, you won't be able to have as much impact in the game. This is also another huge reason as to why you see Alistar a lot in competitive play, because he is a little bit more diverse of a champion. You can play him in multiple different ways, either focusing on peeling or focusing on engaging, but when it comes to solo queue and you want to play an engaged support, Alistar is not going to be one of your better options. Up next on the list, I have Galio, and Galio's support used to be something that was a lot better and had a lot more carry potential when you used to be able to start your taunt and then flash on the enemy. This mechanic allowed you to play a lot more aggressive in the lane phase and also a lot more aggressive in the late game, trying to set up these massive wombo combos for your team and essentially just allowing you to engage properly. Without this mechanic in place for Galio, he doesn't have nearly as much engage, so thus it goes back to the same concept where if you don't have engage, you're not going to be nearly as effective. The rest of his kit still is pretty good when it comes to playing him in the support role because he does have that long distance ultimate. He does have a lot of tanky stats, he has a lot of peeling and a lot of CC overall, but just that fact that he lacks engage is going to make him not the best solo queue champion. Up next on the list, I have Janna, and I do think that Janna can be a decent support champion to play in solo queue, especially if you're playing her a little bit more aggressive. Possibly if you're taking something like Comet plus Domination secondary runes, playing aggressive in the early game and trying to poke your enemies out of lane. I think this playstyle can be good for playing Janna in solo queue and having a large impact in your game, but a lot of the times I'm seeing Janna players play really safe. They're taking Guardian, they're taking Relic Shield, they're playing really far back in the lane, and they're kind of just hoping that they get carried. So Janna as a whole, I think that there is potential for her to have a lot of impact in the games and be a good solo queue champion, but just because the majority of Janna players aren't playing her that way, I feel like it's a safe bet to go ahead and include Janna on this list. Next up on the list, I have Tarik, and Tarik is a champion that you might see a lot in solo queue when he is being played as a funneler for Master Yi, but just looking at the support role itself, Tarik is not going to be the best because if you don't have that synergy with Master Yi, if you aren't trying this cheese duo strat, then the champion by himself is not all that good for solo queue. He's really good again at peeling, his ultimate ability is really good for keeping teammates alive, but in solo queue, what is going to be more important than keeping your teammates alive is making sure that the enemy team is dead. You always want to play aggressive, you always want to make plays in solo queue, you want to try to have as much carry potential as possible, and Tarik, although he is going to keep his teammates alive, you're not actually doing anything to kill the enemy, so you're not actually having all that much carry potential, and you're not going to be doing all too much for your team when it comes to putting the enemy team behind. Instead, all of your focus is trying to make sure your team doesn't fall behind yourself. Overall, I think Tarik's kit is pretty good, but it just isn't one that fits really well in solo queue. Now for the final champion on this list, I have Soraka, and Soraka is kind kind of similar to Janna in the sense that there is a playstyle you can play on this champion that will allow you to have more of a impact in your solo queue games. But the problem is the majority of players, again, aren't playing Soraka that way. When you are playing Soraka, you have the opportunity to play pretty aggressive in lane, especially if you have some runes that are in the sorcery page along the lines of Scorch or anything else that's going to do some extra damage early game. You can definitely bully your enemy out of lane by poking with your Q and by poking with your E. However, again, the majority of Soraka players are standing back in the lane phase. They're not really using their abilities to go aggressive at all. They're standing back. Whenever their teammates get low, they heal them up. Same thing in team fights. They're not really worried about positioning. They're not really worried about using their Q or their E efficiently. All they worry about is trying to get carried. They stay back in team fights. They spam their W. They use their ultimate ability whenever they think it's good. And overall, even though this can be effective because their heals heal for a lot, it's not going to allow you to have all too much carry potential if you're just relying on your teammates to carry you. Well, all right then, ladies and gentlemen, that should just about wrap up the end of this video. I hope you guys did go on to enjoy it. And again, if you guys did go on to enjoy it or find it helpful, then be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end of this one. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.